Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Pain, a reality nearly all of the world's population faces. Emotional and physical, this universal truth is something we don't spend enough time examining. Today we will discuss how we experience, express, treat, and mistreat pain. How does pain shape who we are? Or rather, who would we be without it? A recent book, Pain Studies, answers some of these questions and chronicles the author's experience with migraine. Today we get to speak with the author. Lisa Olstein is the author of 4 poetry collections and is a member of the poetry faculty at the University of Texas at Austin. This book is her first of creative nonfiction. Lisa, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And of course, if we're going to talk about pain and our experience with it, we couldn't begin this critical conversation without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Good day, Lisa. I really enjoyed your book, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thanks so much.
So let's get started. Lisa, many people will probably read your book from vastly different perspectives and backgrounds. So who did you write this book for, and what are you hoping that people might gain by reading it?
You know, I think of that art is a form of essential human research, and I think it's essential for the maker and for the production of knowledge, and that then the reader or viewer becomes a co-creator in that research and that knowledge production. So my book is, it's a nonfiction book, and it's explicitly looking at my experience of migraine as a prism to explore pain in general, perception, and the life of living, the life of the body. And so I see it as an exploration more than a message or an answer. That said, certainly there are millions of migraine sufferers to whom I hope it might speak. And beyond migraine, there are many people who live with other forms of chronic pain. And of course, every human being living in a body encounters pain of various kinds, as you noted. And so I hope it speaks to people, it finds them in their various lived experiences with all that. I also hope that it speaks to sort of the type of nerdy literary readers who enjoy sort of pulling interesting tidbits from the archive and going down unexpected rabbit holes in terms of ideas that sort of ricochet one off of another. And then the truth is you really never know how your work will reach people. You just hope that somehow it does. I had an interesting experience just this past week, actually, where someone who I guess doesn't really use the internet much because I'm not that hard to find. I have a website that uses my name and my email address is available there. But this person actually, they wrote a letter to my poetry publisher hoping it would reach me. And the letter described he and his wife being in their 80s and due to the pandemic being separated because she is undergoing cancer treatment and is severely immunocompromised. They'd been separated for months, and he had been searching for a poem that would comfort them. And he came across a poem of mine that, I wrote maybe 20 years ago. And he was writing to thank me for it and to say that it had really meant something to them in this moment. So there's an example of you sort of put your work out there and you really hope it reaches people in some way.
I appreciate that. You've given me a new introduction I can work on. I can call myself a nerdy literary reader because as you use that, I love that term. And that kind of described the way that I was reading your book. And throughout the book, you examine many different types of pain and the ways that different people have viewed it over time. How do you define pain, and how do you think that definition can better lead people's conversations with each other on the topic of pain?
I mean, I think it's a very slippery thing to try and define. And in fact, so much of our, both sort of our literature, but our cultural approach even to pain is the idea that it's indescribable or that it's untranslatable. And of course, I understand, it exists across this incredibly wide spectrum, and we have these very individualized experiences of them. And so, yes, it's true. It can be very hard to describe, to pin down. It's very subjective. On the other hand, I think actually the idea that it's so impossible to define speaks more to the sort of cold isolation we often find or feel when we're in pain, as much as it speaks to it being indescribable. So I don't think there's one definition. I think there are myriad definitions. And I think our biggest problem comes with being able to listen to one another in those descriptions and in those varying definitions, because they do have the power to translate if we listen. And I think that empathy and listening is one of the things that pain, it can lead us away from it, but it can also lead us right over the threshold and into greater capacities for that. I also think that pain is in some ways, it's like a magnifying lens. It turns up the volume on fundamentally being human, by being a sentient being in a body. And so in those ways, its definitions, again, are multifold and highly individual, but not so different from the way we go about translating our experience for one another across all kinds of different elements or aspects of being human.
And you point out in the book repeatedly that we try, or at least your point is, we try to sometimes standardize pain levels to fit everybody. And you just pointed out that pain is really not, we're not capable of doing that because it means something or feels differently to each one of us, which is why that listening component is so important when we're talking to one another about pain. I
would also add that sometimes we're not asking in the right way, or we're not able to listen openly. So there's a place in the book where I refer to Elaine Scarry, who's written a seminal book, The Body in Pain, and she talks about her sort of opening premise in the very introduction is that pain is indescribable in language. But then she goes on to say that the sort of fragments of language that people in pain use to describe their experience absolutely cohere into these cogent categories that allow doctors and researchers to understand better what someone is going through, to better treat it, and sometimes to even cure a condition. So I think some of it is about that standardization that you mentioned, and that we are maybe superimposing paradigms or definitions that are not very useful. And I also think there's a reactivity, so that when those standards aren't met, or when standard treatments don't work, then there's a reaction on the part of the establishment or the individual doctor that moves from sort of interest and potentially sympathy to denial. Like, if it doesn't tick this box, or if it doesn't respond in this way, then now I no longer am able to even listen to your experience or believe in its truth.
A recent edition of National Geographic actually talked about some of the progress, quote unquote progress, being made in the ability of doctors to, measure, and again, I use air quotes there, pain, by, watching what the brain is doing in an effort to better understand its relativity to different individuals. I think what you said is really important, though, and hopefully people take that away from your book, medical professional or otherwise, that, while there may very well be some practical uses for that could certainly be helpful, it's also important that we not tell people that their pain doesn't exist just because it doesn't show up in the way that we expect it to. That's the, I think respecting that it comes in different, as you pointed out, many different forms, and in many ways defies definition, due to the myriad of forms it takes. And Lisa, your experience with pain is very personal, and I think anybody who reads your book will see that. During the book, you share your experience living with migraine. And this is one of those things that I think a lot of people have some misconceptions about, or maybe aren't very familiar with. So how can those of us that do not live with migraine, or don't live with it on any regular basis, better understand the real effects for those who experience? How can we talk about this in a respectful way and try to empathize with people who do experience it and who do live with it.
The world requires greater empathy from us on so many levels, right? And so whether it is having COVID severely, having COVID mildly, but in an extremely extended version, or whether it is suffering at the hands of white supremacy or police brutality, imagination and empathy are essential to living in and bettering this world. So I think listening to one another, being willing to see what's in front of us, being open to experience that we don't share, and not rejecting it as untrue if not directly experienced by us. These are pretty foundational requirements right now of being citizens. So, I do a lot of describing of experience with migraine, of physical, sort of narrative experience and anecdote and attempts to treat it, and my own attempts to describe it. Some of them are very direct and others are very sort of metaphorical. And if those open up opportunities for readers to have a better sense of what it feels like to have a migraine, that's great, because it is something, it's a condition that afflicts millions of people. But that's not really my goal. I didn't write it really to be understood. I think I wrote it to understand more myself, and hopefully to create almost like a current that someone could drop their boat into and sort of join me on a trip downstream. Because as much as I wanted to write about migraine, I wanted to write sort of into and from it. And so I was making a lot of decisions in terms of what I included and how I was writing it that were an attempt to reflect the way the mind moves when it's dealing with pain, encountering it. Sometimes one is dulled by pain, but sometimes one is made much more awake. Sometimes the places we go are very isolated. Sometimes they're incredibly communal. So it was an attempt to kind of embody some of the aspects of experience that my particular journey with pain has opened up for me. And that might give somebody a window into migraine who doesn't experience it, but I would prioritize more than that, it being an opportunity to open up their own experiences to them.
We've been talking with Lisa Olstein, author of Pain Studies, about how we define pain and her experience with it. But a number of questions still remain. How does pain shape who we are, or rather, who would we be without it? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Emotional and physical pain is a universal truth and is something we don't spend enough time examining. We're speaking with Lisa Olstein, the author of 4 poetry collections and a member of the poetry faculty at the University of Texas at Austin, about the significance of pain.
Lisa, you open up chapter 18 by sharing a quote from one of my favorite TV shows, House MD. In this excerpt, you show the dichotomy of pain and how we all experience it differently. Yet it is universal in that it helps to shape each of us and who we are. How do we reconcile our different experiences?
One of the problems in treating pain or in helping a loved one who experiences pain is a pressure towards resolution, or a pressure towards a neat solution. And when those are available, terrific. Everyone in pain would love for it to be resolved. But quite often, that's not on offer. And I think, likewise, there's no way around the fact that we experience a wide range of kinds of pain, and we're going to each experience them differently. Not just sort of intrinsic difference, but differences of access and privilege and what we're able to do or what we're forced to do when we're in a certain state. So I don't know that reconciliation is always possible, and that's okay. I think it's more about being able to be with what can be uncomfortable, which is the full range of experience. And through that sort of openness, I think it's the resistance that provides a lot of the difficulty. If we could be a little less resistant to the lack of reconciliation or the lack of resolution, we would be able to sit with it and deal with it a lot more easily.
I really like that answer because I'm a fixer. When my wife gets a bad migraine, I've always throughout the years wanted to fix it. And it's just been recently where I'm like, no, it needs to run its course and it is what it is. And there isn't a fix or a reconciliation. It's just something that we've learned to deal with and that she's had to learn to deal with. And then our relationship learns to deal with it. And then we just go on and get better. So I really appreciate your answer.
Yeah. And it's crucial that, we don't confuse the acceptance of reality or what we have to deal with surrender, and it isn't, I would never advocate that someone not try to resolve their migraine problem if that's at all possible or whatever other pain. I think, though, that we have to accept, and we as a culture, and especially our medical culture, is very bad at accepting it when it doesn't tie itself up neatly. And that's the trouble with things that are chronic. We flock to a crisis, whether it's health or a natural disaster or any number of other examples. We sort of rush in when there's a crisis, and our attention is captivated and we are there for one another. And it's much, much harder for us to sustain attention and care and thoughtfulness when something becomes chronic.
On many levels, there's all sorts of things that we pretty much just have to accept. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we give up on trying to. And I guess we have to be careful too, right, about using the word fix, because that kind of speaks to the idea that it is something that can be solved. But I think, historically, we see that humans have this innate desire to try to overcome things that are not pleasant for us or things that, cause us pain. So, and that's actually something in chapter 18 that we wanted to take a minute to discuss. You share an exchange with one of your doctors, and there's a quote on page 87 where you say, your doctor says, "No part of you seems to be identifying with your condition," which is, for the most part, good. Frequently in long-term patients, we see an identification develop, and that is important to address. You opt to not directly address this statement, yet throughout your book, the idea that pain shapes who we are is pervasive. So when we talk about fixing it, when we talk about getting rid of it, the question is, does pain define us, or rather, who would we be if we didn't have the pain?
Different individuals cope with circumstances in different ways. For me, a certain amount of denial and compartmentalization has proven to be highly useful. There are other people I know who have conditions similar to mine who needed to have an opposite approach, who I know a documentary film maker who has a condition similar to mine. And once she tipped over into a sort of severe space, she devoted all the energy available to her to making a documentary about her own illness journey. And to me, that would be absolutely antithetical to how I would want to deal with it. To her, it was the best possible approach. So I think there's just a huge range in terms of how we respond. And what's difficult is sort of how much judgment can be overlaid from external sources, but also internally. I think that, as you said a minute ago, of course, pain is, and a desire to escape from it is a fundamental aspect of human experience. But so too, or going along with it, is a tendency to judge it or assign or ascribe certain meanings to it. And sometimes those are religious. Sometimes those are about people's personalities. And those can be as damaging as the pain itself. So, I would say that, like any core aspect of our experience, of course, pain shapes us, and then we sort of, who we are shapes it back. It doesn't play out the same way for every person in every circumstance.
Lisa, you share a number of different quotes about the significance of pain from a variety of sources, but one that really stood out to me, you say, quote, "I am not searching for meaning in it because it doesn't mean anything," end quote. that kind of seems like maybe pain is a paradox, one we can't escape. So, how do we keep going? Why should any of us keep searching for solutions to our pain, or should we not? And like you've kind of stated throughout, our talk, that it's just something that we all learn to deal with in a different way and persevere on with this thing that we call life.
I think there's an important difference between a sense of meaninglessness about life because it includes pain, versus what I was hoping to speak to in that part of the book, which is we tend to impregnate, if you will, pain sometimes with these imported meanings that don't necessarily pan out or don't serve us. So the idea that we experience pain, that it means something about us, or that it ascribes to us a certain destiny, or it is an example of, let's say, God's love or God's wrath, or our worthiness or our unworthiness. That's the type of meaning we, I think, desperately grasp after, but that I'm not buying.
Pain doesn't make life meaningless, but pain doesn't necessarily come with its own meaning.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we are in pain, we want an answer, like, why is this happening to us? And I agree with you that there is no reason about it. It just is, right?
Exactly. And that causes us a lot of cognitive dissonance, I think, because we're sort of trained to overlay this idea of meaning and causality, and sometimes chance or circumstance, or just the fact of being a biological organism is the answer. And it isn't the kind of answer we have been trained to look for.
Just because we don't like what the answer is, or just because the answer is not the typical type of answer we'd expect, doesn't mean that you don't have an answer. It just means that the ones you're looking for might not, they may do more harm than good, I think. And that's the other important thing to take away is sometimes if you feel like you have to find meaning in it, it can distract you from living a better life because you spend so much time preoccupied with why it's happening as opposed to what could be done about it or how to live with it.
Or even what it might be teaching you.
Right.
Which I want to caution, not in a religious sense or a moralistic sense. I don't mean that, suffering is a lesson that comes from outside to teach you something and quote unquote, everything happens for a reason. I think that those ideas can actually be incredibly damaging to people who are suffering. I mean, instead that, it is a fundamental aspect of human experience. And so when you undergo it, you learn things about yourself, you learn things about the world, you learn things about other people.
How can we use the lessons of pain studies in our modern society, and how might these observations better inform our conversations about pain? Well, that's what Lance and I will discuss in the next segment of the show. Lisa, we really enjoyed your book and appreciate you taking some time to speak with Lance and me.
It was a pleasure talking with you.
Lisa Olstein is the author of Pain Studies, which you can purchase by visiting thestateofus.org or anywhere books are found. How can we use the lessons of pain studies in our modern society, and how might these observations better inform our conversations about pain? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Today, we had the opportunity to speak with Lisa Olstein, who's the author of Pain Studies, about how we as a culture define pain and what her experience has been like with it. We also talked about the important identity culture of pain. And I think she hit on, Lance, several really important points, right? I mean, one of those is the cold isolation that pain often makes us feel. We tend to kind of draw back into ourselves and assume. I think one of the assumptions that's dangerous, right, that we all do is, and I think it's not conscious as much as it is a feeling that we have, right, is this: nobody knows what this is like. Nobody's ever felt this before. And while that actually could be true from a statistical side of things, it's probably pretty likely that somebody else out there has. Now, whether or not you'll ever be able to realize that, or whether or not we'd ever be able to prove that, that's a whole other spectrum. But I think it's, we have to be careful with that, right? Because we can unintentionally isolate us when understanding that our pain is something that we all experience, and that just because the thing we're going through may seem objectively worse than somebody else doesn't mean that, relatively speaking, that they haven't been through something that for them would be just as bad, so to say.
You know, what I take away from that, and I think that's the really cool thing, especially when you talk to someone who is a writer and in particular known for poetry, there's so many different meanings that you can take from things. But for me, that isolation means that sometimes when you're in pain, you're impervious to everything around you, that your pain just engulfs you to the point where you either pull yourself away from everyone else physically, or you just do it mentally to where and then you're alone with your pain, you know. And I think, that's kind of where I went with it. But I do see your point there. And also it's that whole concept of, we all deal with it differently. We didn't really get a chance to talk to her, and it's not good or bad, but two, the whole idea of, and maybe this is a misnomer, you know, we can talk about this a little bit, but we've always had a saying as, especially when I'm dealing in the athletic realm, of people's level of pain tolerance, that some people, you know, you don't know. Okay. And we try to say, well, that, you know, you twisted your ankle. That doesn't really hurt me. Come on now. I've played on a twisted ankle before. Let's go, tape it up, and let's go. And for other people, they're writhing around like, you know, they need to be amputated. And I don't know how real that is, but I noticed that in dealing with all of the athletes and people that I've come in contact with in 35 years of coaching and education, that there is something, at least seems to be something real to that, and that may be the point of how we all deal with pain. You know, some of us are able to compartmentalize it, I think she said, and makes a good point that we can compartmentalize it and put it over here, and it doesn't stop us from continuing to advance to whatever goal that we're looking for. And maybe some of us can't do that as well. Maybe the pain level or the pain intensity is the same. But again, unless I misunderstood our author, that doesn't matter, right? That's not really important. And that's what we try to do, is we try to define it. And there really isn't that definition. Whether we have a pain like somebody else or not, it doesn't matter. That's not the point of this, is, you know, don't put me on a 1 to 10 scale.
I think, you know, and this is the real challenge, right, Lance, is the problem is that part of what the medical community is there to do, whether it's emotional, maybe emotional is not exactly the right word, whether it's psychological pain or whether it's physical pain, I think that the problem is, I don't want to say problem, but the challenge is that community is there they want to make people better, right? So you're in this situation where we're trying to make it better. Well, how do we make it better? Well, when we look at a lot of other problems, we have to define it, right? We have to do the research, and we have to come up with a way to measure it and a way to, you know, scan it or to examine it. And pain is one of those very difficult in that regard for a lot of reasons. And that's why I thought that piece in National Geographic about pain was so interesting, is okay. You know, if we're able to scan people's brains and see how everybody universally brain reacts to certain pain, and yet then does that almost open up more questions about then why is how we handle it so, you know, why is all of that so different then? But I do think that's the careful balance, as she pointed out, about we don't want to give up or discourage the medical community from going that route, but we also want to make sure the medical community is being very conscientious of not dismissing people's pain as merely a figment of their imagination, right? Because I think that's one of those things with pain. I mean, I experienced that a little bit in sports. Sometimes, you have somebody who tells you you're not in pain. And that is one of those things. I just don't know if you can do that, Lance. I'm not sure it's okay to ever do that in any situation, to tell somebody their pain's not real, right? If you are feeling it, it's real. Now, is it physical versus psychological? That might be a different question. And that's kind of murky too, right? Because pain is it might be caused by something physical, or it might be caused by something psychological, but it all manifests as a feeling, as an emotion. And maybe that's part of why it's a difficult thing to measure and to diagnose.
Our pain is a personal experience. It's not necessarily out there for everybody else to share, nor do we want to share it. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think what you're describing is that when we have pain, it is personal. So why does anybody feel the need then to judge it? Other than, as you point out, to try to fix it, especially when it's their job, or when, as I was explaining earlier in the show, I want to make people feel better. So if you tell me it's a 6 and then I go back to you in an hour and you tell me it's a 2, I did it. Their pain is less. But is it? They're still in pain. And is pain? And if it's relatively better to describe it for me, that doesn't help necessarily the person who is in the pain, because it's a personal experience, which is what I think we need to understand. And I did and we talk about it too, in every episode, that we want to have open, honest conversation. And she talked about that we have to improve our listening skills.
Welcome the range of experiences, right?
I thought those were some important pieces as well. And when you mentioned the National Geographic article, it's the January 2020 edition, right? Of the magazine. If people want to pick it up, as well as they want to read that along with, Mrs. Olstein's book, Pain Studies. They make for a good, total look, as more of a scientific look and a kind of a literary look at this whole thing this whole topic that we call pain.
Well, and I think she pointed out too, Lance, that her book is more about taking readers on a journey with her than it is making a specific point per se.
And that's really what it is. You kind of just get her
and she's a
going
poet,
through,
right? I mean, so that's that. Not necessarily making it's kind of more of, I want to take you through this experience, and then it's about what you get out of it. And so it's very different than I think most of what we've done, right, up until this point, where most of the books that we cover are about a topic and conclude with some sort of opinion or some sort of significant takeaway. And I think that's kind of what's interesting about this book, is different people are going to read it and take different things away from it. And that's kind of not all that different than pain itself, right? People are going to go through it. They're going to experience it differently. One of the things that I thought she mentioned that was kind of interesting, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, Lance, is the denial can be helpful, right? We often think of denial as a bad thing, or as a negative thing, much like we think of pain that way too, right? But we didn't really get to talk to her about this as much. But pain and denial, while both have negative connotations, they are also pretty important to who we are as people, or they're important to making us who we are. Pain is one of those things that is also a good thing, in that it can keep us safe and can
it makes
keep us
aware
wise.
that, maybe I'm hurt.
Right, exactly.
I've been working many times, out in the field, and I'm just sawing away or hacking away at something, or then all of a sudden it's like, that kind of hurts, and I look down and there's blood spewing from my arm. I kind of just ripped my skin open, but that feeling of pain made me look down. And not that I've ever hurt myself to the point that I was going to bleed to death or whatever, but pain sometimes lets you know that there's something wrong with you and you need to get it checked out. Or if you're talking about early warning signs of a heart attack or a stroke, that those little glitches of pain can help us survive.
Same thing on the mental front too, right? I mean, if you keep coming back to this thing and it's causing you strife, that pain can be making you say, this might be something I need to address, right? Or maybe I need to go talk to this person because this is on my mind. I don't feel good about the way it happened, right? So, I think it's important.
And I need to talk to somebody about it. And as I talk, I start to feel better about it.
And so I think it's important to note that as well, that while pain, most people think of, that, we don't want that. That's a bad thing. Pain is also something that's very, it's a practical thing. Being biological creatures and emotional creatures, it is important to how we deal with it. And I just want to reiterate that last point she made, because I think this is important to end on, Lance, right? Is pain doesn't have to make life meaningless. And I think this is one of those themes that House, for people out there who are familiar with it, debates throughout the series. I don't know if it ever really arrives at a conclusion, but at different points, it kind of contends that, pain tells us that life doesn't mean anything. And and the conclusion that I get from the book is not that. It's that pain doesn't make life meaningless, but pain doesn't necessarily come with its own built-in meaning either. Now, we may get meaning from pain in that we may learn things, right, as we go through pain about ourselves, about others. We may grow as people because of what we go through. But the pain itself doesn't necessarily, and sometimes we spend a lot of time and waste a lot of time searching for that meaning, and we can do harm by doing that. If that's the approach we take. So it's kind of interesting.
Please, again, our regular listeners, why we're here. Our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we'd love for you to share this with your friends. And we think it's something, obviously, we generally ask the question, why should you care about this? And as we've talked, we all have pain. We all experience it. We all know people who are in pain or have experienced pain. So this is an interesting take, a little bit of a different look on the topic. So please make sure you share that with people. And remember, you can share it. Let them know that we are found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and it's also a radio show, a syndicated radio show out there. So we'll post the book right on the website, and if you're interested, there'll be a link there where you can purchase it.
We try to live up to that honest and open, respectful component. And the honest and open means that when we can, we provide that stuff to you at thestateofus.org, books, articles, links, and more. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our guest, Lisa Olstein, the author of Pain Studies, and of course, our producer, Bradley Butch, for making this episode possible. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.